WWE Wrestlemania X8, released in 2002 for Nintendo Gamecube courtesy of THQ and Ukes, the people who brought you them wonderful SmackDown games on the PlayStation, and also a whole bunch of WWE games afterwards. Interesting tidbit about this game: WrestleMania X8 was released a short while after the World Wildlife Fund, or as some of us call them, the Panda People, laid the smackdown on old Vinnie Mac, forcing the World Wrestling Federation to change its name to World Wrestling Entertainment. And so while the packaging features the then brand spanking new WWE logo, the game itself still bears the old WWF scratch logo. And upon closer inspection, so does this official merchandising hologram sticker gimmick thing on the cover. Presumably they didn't have time to change it in-game, so they just left it in. Which technically makes this the final WWF video game ever made. Which really doesn't mean much because all they really did was get the F out, and over the years so did a whole lot of people, but that's besides the point. Back to WrestleMania X8. Of the three first forays in this then new console generation, WrestleMania X8 has the most recent roster, or more up-to-date roster of the time, featuring some former WCW and ECW mainstays like Booker T and Rob Van Dam, as well as the original NWO trio of Hollywood Hogan, Kevin Nash, and the late Scott Hall in his only WWE video game as an active wrestler before getting released later that year, and wouldn't appear in another game until, WWE 2K16 or something? So whatever I say about the game, GameCube owners had the luxury of having the most up-to-date roster for their pilot WWE game at the time. There's also a number of modes and match types, aside from the exhibition mode where you could play a quick match of the usual suspects. Singles, tag team, Royal Rumble, steel cage, no holds barred, handicaps, and for the first time in a WWE video game, a proper Hell in a Cell that recreates the actual structure as you would see it on TV, and not just slap a roof on top of the standard steel cage, among other things. You also have Path of a Champion, which is a basic mode where you pick one of the various WWE Championship titles to compete for, and basically win a whole bunch of matches until you eventually win the title, which unlocks a new wrestler to play with. And because there's no women's championship per se, the ladies can compete for the men's title, which, okay, fair enough, they did the same thing with Raw on Xbox. Amazingly, there's no Fred Durst to be found here, even though Undertaker comes out to his Rollin' theme. I guess Sony and Xbox does what Nintendo don't, or something. I suppose I really don't care. There is also a Battle for the Belts mode, where you can compete for over 50 made-up belts and defend them and such. So that's where TK got the idea from. Gotcha. I like that a lot of the belts are made to somewhat resemble other non-WWF titles. There's a replica of the NWA 10 Pounds of Gold title, for example, among others, so that's kind of nice. There's also quite a few GCW Championship titles. Years before that promotion became a thing people cared about, it's actually not a bad idea or anything, and having a whole bunch of belts to challenge for, defend, and even unify seems somewhat forward-thinking, and not something you'd see until later down the road. These are all fine and dandy, and the Battle for the Belts things is a neat concept once you get to defend against other players or unify them or whatever. But these are basic single-player modes at best and doesn't quite fill the need for a proper season/story/career/whatever mode that you were getting over at SmackDown or even the N64 games. I personally don't care for such things, but it might be a sticking point for some of you, so... And of course the game has a Create a Wrestler feature, pretty standard fare by this point, where you could either create a new WWF Superstar Wrestler from scratch, or customize any of the other folks featured in the game, and change their movesets, which I didn't realize was a thing you could do until I started digging deep into it. As far as customization goes, it's fairly good. Has more than enough choices for appearances and moves and such. Could it have been better? Sure, always, but otherwise... little to complain about in this Create a Wrestler feature, so we'll move on. The gameplay of WrestleMania X8 is something of a strange hybrid of the SmackDown and Aki schools of thought as far as wrestling games are concerned. You have a meter which builds up as you're attacking, and once it's filled, you'll gain a special move charge, which allows you to execute your special move by pressing the A and B buttons in the right conditions. You can store up to 3 specials, and each superstar usually has a couple specials, though moves allow for up to 4 specials. But no 2 specials from the same position, if that makes any sense. Probably not. In addition to that, you also have a spirit block thing, which changes colors depending on how hot you are. When the meter is red, you've got momentum, the crowd's cheering you on, and this entitles you to slightly better stats. When the meter is blue, you're in the dumps, the crowd is not behind you, and momentum is about as fleeting as finding a good Fiend match. In any event, this is something to keep track of because it determines how strong or how tired your superstar might be and hinges on how well your comeback efforts turn out to be. So you've got aspects of two different games merged into this one amalgamation, and the end result is a perfectly playable little game, I think. I hear chatter about the gameplay being not up to snuff, and sure, I wouldn't go so far to say that it's better or worse than what you had before, but it is largely playable. Pull off your moves with relative ease, there's some semblance of thought put into how matches play out, and while it takes a while to get used to the controls, there is a helpful diagram in the pause menus you could bring up to remind you which buttons do what, though they won't tell you everything because some actions require 2 buttons to perform, like Irish whips and such as it is, and for what it's worth, it controls fine, I think. Sure, there's the occasional jank of collision detection, and fewer buttons means you'll be pressing 2 buttons for certain actions, but it's not as bad as I've heard some people say, and no worse than in other games that I've played. Personally, I think the game plays fine. I haven't run into any real crippling issues, and of course, there's always going to be room for improvement, but you've got a solid base here at least, which is the nicest thing I could really say about it. For a pilot effort on the GameCube, I'm almost inclined to say that Wrestlemania X8 looks somewhat The arenas are at least nicely rendered, probably a little dark in the lighting to hide the cardboard audience, but they look the part and you have a good dozen sets to play around with once you start unlocking them. The models of the various wrestlers somewhat look the part, but they're not the best quality. They look somewhat plasticky, almost like they're living, breathing mannequins from Sharp. The animations also kind of look stiff and robotic and somewhat lifeless, but there's character-specific animations for victories like Steve Austin drinking beer and Triple H burying people. Or maybe that's Hogan brother. I don't know, one or the other. They both have 3 initials. Entrances aren't too bad. They try to recreate those as best as they could. I've seen worse. The audio front is also a bit of a mixed bag. You have most of the wrestler themes on here. I say most because there are omissions. Neither Booker T, the NWO, or even the Hardys have their usual entrance music, but instead use stock generic instrumentals that sound nothing like the said songs, which is odd because Undertaker comes out the rollin' and not a Limp Bizkit frontman to be found in this game, as was the case with the other 2 games on the same generation. The game also has other generically generic-sounding background tunes that play during the gameplay and menus. Surprisingly, no commentary to be found here because SmackDown had commentary and it sucked, so nothing of value was lost in that regard. Sound effects are usual collections of sound effects, nothing particularly special in that regard, so yeah, I guess not. The best way I could describe Wrestlemania X8 is that it is a pilot episode of sorts on the GameCube. The first game on a new console, which is always going to be rough and bare bones, and this certainly takes the cake. Handful of wrestlers to choose from. A couple play modes and a bunch of match types, the gameplay being fine, but not quite up to par with what came before. Not quite as solid or as fun as the Aki games, and feels a little slower compared to the SmackDown stock, but on the flip side it plays well enough, provides a solid base for future games to follow. In the long run, Wrestlemania X8 exists solely to have product on a new system, and it's adequate fare at best, which means it could only get better from here. All in all, Wrestlemania X8 is perfectly functional, and if nothing else, is a far better game than Raw on Xbox, or the first SmackDown to grace PS2, based solely on the more up-to-date content for the time, but offers nothing noteworthy that merits anything more than a passing mention these days. Fine game, sure, but you could do better. And there is better. Next time. Kind of. Sort of. It's complicated.